Hi, my name is Mr. Ray, and this is the end of the world in Bible prophecy. This is section 1, the end as described in the Gospels. That's the three books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the Bible. This is part 2, the desolation of Jerusalem. In part 1, we talked about the gospel age and the beginning of sorrows. After that point, the three gospel accounts differ. Matthew and Mark begin to speak of an event called the abomination of desolation. But Luke describes the desolation of Jerusalem in different terms. The information from all three accounts combines to give us a complete picture. So we're going to look at Luke's account first. Leading up to this, we covered the gospel age and the beginning of sorrows. The gospel age would be the time from the disciples' lives where they preached the gospel, then to the gospel message of Christ and the Bible going out to the whole world. And then towards the end of that, Jesus talked about a period of time called the beginning of sorrows, or he talked about a phenomenon, really. It's not really one section of time, but it's a phenomenon where certain signs appear more often and more intensely as the time of the end approaches. So there's the gospel age, and as it comes to an end, you start seeing the beginning of sorrows and these things that have happened throughout history, but now they become such as wars and famines and diseases, but now they become more intense, more global, and more frequent and more powerful, with times of peace in between. That's the beginning of sorrow. So we're going to go now to the next subject that he talks about in those same passages, where he's talked about how the disciples are going to go through the gospel age, the beginning of sorrows, and now he starts talking about the desolation of Jerusalem. We're going to go to Luke's account first. So Luke 21:20 says, "And when you will see Jerusalem compassed with armies or surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Let all them who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto." So get out of Judea when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. "For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and will be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." So summing it up, Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies. Now Jesus is talking before his death and before his resurrection, so somewhere around 30 AD. And he says Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies. Israelites will be killed and carried away captive into all nations. Then Jerusalem will be trodden down until the times of the Gentiles ends. So this whole thing is we're going to see started about 70 AD, the fulfillment of this. Okay, so we're going to go back now and look at the history of the desolation of Jerusalem and see how it fulfills the prophecies that Jesus just gave us in the Gospels. All right, so we start out with the two emperors that were, or two of the emperors that were in power when Jesus was alive. First of all, Augustus Caesar on the left. He is the one that was in power when Jesus was born. And then Tiberius Caesar was the emperor when Jesus was crucified. Caligula became the emperor of Rome in 37 AD. So this is 7 years after the crucifixion of Christ. In 39 AD, he ordered the Roman army under General Petronius to place his statue in the Jerusalem temple. Now, Satan has been wanting to do this throughout history. He's been wanting to set himself up as God and be worshipped as God. And so, in the person of Caligula now, he orders General Petronius to put his statue in the Jerusalem temple, and for the Jews, of course, to have to worship him. And then if the Jews resisted this, they were to be killed and the entire nation would be taken into captivity. Well, Petronius was met by a large number of Jewish people who came to plead with him. We know this because Josephus described it. And Petronius made a bold move and decided to defy Caligula and not put his statue in Jerusalem. Well, Caligula ordered Petronius to kill himself, but the news back then traveled slowly, and the news of Caligula's own death reached Petronius before his suicide order reached him. And so, happily, Petronius didn't have to obey the orders of a dead emperor. Well, Nero came to power next in 54 AD, and in 66 AD, the Jewish people revolted against Rome. Within 3 months, the Roman legate of Syria, who was Cestius Gallus, brought the 12th legion of the Roman army to Jerusalem. Now, at this point, this is 66 AD, Gallus surrounds Jerusalem, but then he was forced to retreat. And this gave the Christians the opportunity to flee. Now, you remember Jesus had said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of town and get out of the city and get out of Judea. And so he surrounded Jerusalem, but then he was forced to retreat. And so seeing that surrounding of Jerusalem, this gave the Christians the opportunity to flee, realizing that what Christ said had come true. But though others remained and were rejoicing, thinking that they had been given a great victory by God. So Jesus warned the people, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, get out. And so they saw Jerusalem surrounded. The army retreated. The believers left the city. Everybody else thought they had won a victory. Nero then appointed Vespasian to put down the rebellion. Well, Nero committed suicide in 68 AD, and after a period of chaos, Vespasian actually became the Roman emperor. So he was the one that had been ordered to put down the rebellion, but he took the throne in 70 AD and appointed Titus to come and finish the job in Jerusalem. So although the Jewish people thought that God had given them a great victory, what he had given them was a chance to obey the words of Christ and get out of Judea. Titus then surrounded Jerusalem with 4 Roman legions, conquered the city, and destroyed the temple in 70 AD, just as Jesus had predicted. It's reported that not one Christian died because they had fled to Pella when Jerusalem had first been surrounded in 66 AD. 4 years earlier, they'd all fled, and then 4 years later, the temple was destroyed, just as Jesus had predicted. So Luke's description of the beginning of the Jewish desolation includes the following events. First, the invasion of the Romans. Again, that initial invasion where they just surrounded Jerusalem and then were forced to retreat, giving everybody who believed Christ's words a chance to get out of Jerusalem and then and get out of Judea. And then the following invasion under Titus and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed and the temple area was leveled, just as Jesus had predicted, 40 years earlier. Then Luke also mentions the dispersion of the Jews into all the nations. So they were they fled from Israel into all the nations and their persecution among those nations. So Jesus predicted that the Jewish people would be persecuted in all the nations of the world. Not that he gave those nations permission to do that. Any nation that persecutes the Jewish people ends up being judged and destroyed by God. So they persecuted among the nations. They're persecuted among the nations. And then the third thing that Luke's description includes is the Gentile domination of Jerusalem, which is continuing today. Now, as we look at what's called the times of the Gentiles, or the Gentile domination of Jerusalem, from 70 AD to 390 AD, Jerusalem was ruled by Rome. Then from 390 AD to about 634 AD, Jerusalem was under the Byzantine Empire rule. After Rome broke into the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, Jerusalem was under the Byzantine Empire. And so then from 634 AD to 1099 AD, they were under Muslim rule. From 1099 AD to 1291 AD, the Crusaders, the Muslims, and the Mongols all had various times when they were dominating Jerusalem. Then from about 1291 AD to 1516 AD, there was Muslim Mamluk rule. And then 1516 to 1917, Jerusalem was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Then in World War I, the Turkish Ottoman Empire was defeated and the British gained control over Palestine. In 1917, the British allowed the Jewish people to begin to return to Israel under the Balfour Declaration. Now, there was some political stoppage of that. There was all kinds of conflict that began at that point. And then Satan raised up Adolf Hitler to stop Britain and the Jewish people. And so after World War II, the Jewish people then regained the land. Israel became a nation in 1948. And then many of the Jewish people were allowed to come into the land. 1967, Israel took over Jerusalem. So the times of the Gentiles now seem to be nearing an end. But the thing that has not been taken over by the Jewish people is the temple area. It is still being trampled by the Gentiles through the Islamic control of the Dome of the Rock. Now, the times of the Gentiles will continue until the temple is rebuilt and the sacrifices restored for the Jewish people. So we see that the times of the Gentiles seem to be drawing to a close because the Jewish people now have their own country, and that country then took over Jerusalem. And so the Jewish people are in control of Jerusalem, but they are not in control of the Temple Mount. And so the final step in that story has yet to happen. Okay, so now we're going to look at the culmination of desolation. So the desolation of Jerusalem began in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, and then the trampling of Jerusalem by the Gentiles has continued from that point on. Now we're going to see what the final act of desolation is, the culmination of the desolation of Jerusalem. And what that's called is the abomination in the holy place. So Matthew 24:15 says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place," whoever reads, let him understand, "then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes." You say, well, here's Jesus telling again them to flee Judea. This is under a slightly different circumstance. Remember, the first time it was a surrounding of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem is surrounded, then flee to Judea. And here he says, when there's an abomination of desolation set up in the holy place, which is quite a bit different than just surrounding Jerusalem. There's an abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So it is a second time to flee Judea. Once at the beginning of the desolation, and now once at the end of the desolation, or the culmination of it. It says then, let him which is in the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And Mark echoes the same thing. He says, but when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not. Now notice this says standing where it ought not, and we're gonna we're going to find out why Mark writes things a little bit differently than Matthew. Matthew is very specific. Matthew tells a very specific place in the temple called the holy place. Mark just gives kind of the general where it shouldn't be. All right, and both of those are true. It's in the holy place and it shouldn't be there. Let him, the reader, understand, but we'll see why Mark puts it in these terms later. Then let them which in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him that is in the housetop not go down to the house. Let neither enter therein to take anything out of his house. And let him that is in the field not turn back again to take up his garment. And then Matthew goes on to describe a time of the greatest tribulation that the world will ever see. And it's shortened for the sake of the elect. And so Matthew says that, and woe to them that are with child and to them that give suck in those days, but pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor shall ever be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And this is why in this second episode of desolation, or at the end of the desolation, the description has not been fulfilled yet, because we haven't seen a time of great tribulation that threatens all flesh. That's all people. Okay, so not all the people in the whole world have been threatened when Jerusalem was destroyed. So the description was very close to it. Back in Luke, he says, that there's going to be, you don't want to have children in those days. You don't want to have young children in those days because you're going to need to get out of Judea. Okay, but in the beginning, Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, and then they destroy Jerusalem and level the temple area. And that's the beginning of the desolation. In this particular case, something is set up in the holy place, and then the world is hit with a tribulation that we're only going to see once. It'll be worse than anything the world has ever seen, including World War II, including all the wars that have been up to this point. So there's going to be a great tribulation, and no flesh would be saved except those days would be shortened. So God is going to have to intervene to prevent all of humanity from being wiped out. Mark 13:17 says, but woe to them that are with child and to them that give suck in those days, and pray that your flight is not in the winter. For in those days will be affliction such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall it be. Again, the phrasing in Mark is a little bit different, and we'll find out why later, but we'll include this, from the beginning of creation which God created. Notice his emphasis on the beginning. Matthew just says, well, from the beginning of the world to this time, and it mentions nothing about God creating the world. But in this one, the beginning of the creation that God created unto this time, neither shall be. So there's an emphasis on creation in there, which is very interesting. But we'll come back and explain why in a little bit. Verse 20, except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he has chosen, the chosen people of God, he has shortened the days. And then he says, beware of false Christs and false prophets. And he says, then if any man shall say to you, lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there will arise false Christs and false prophets, or false messiahs and false prophets, and will show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you ahead of time, or before. And Mark echoes the same. And then if any man will say to you, lo, here is Christ, or lo, here he is there, believe him not. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and will show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. But take ye heed, behold, I have foretold you all things. And this is why he says to not not pay attention to people who say, oh, Christ is over here or Christ is over there, because the real coming of Christ is going to be evident everywhere. You're going to be able to, you'll know it when he comes, and there's going to be a gathering of eagles to the carcass. Here's where it says that in Matthew. Mark doesn't really mention this, but Matthew does. Matthew 24:27, for as the lightning comes out of the east and shines even to the west. In other words, it's obvious everywhere. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And we're going to get into the gathering, the various gatherings that they're talking about. But there's been a lot said here, for wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And some people have said, well, that's the birds coming to eat the flesh of the armies that come against Christ. But wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. You think about this, the Bible talks about believers as mounting up with wings like eagles. In other words, that believers are often likened to eagles. But what would a carcass be? Well, it would be something that died that gives the eagles nourishment. Well, Jesus Christ died, and he is our spiritual nourishment. So it may be that Christ here is referring to himself. Wherever I am, the carcass, the person who died, to give them sustenance, there will the eagles be gathered together, that they'll be gathered together to him. So it's not super evident which way is the correct interpretation, so we'll just leave it there. But the real coming of Christ is going to be, the point is, it's going to be obvious everywhere. It's going to be like lightning. It happens in the east, you see it, you see the flash all the way to the west. The idea is that it's everywhere. And you're going to see it everywhere. It's going to be obvious, so don't be chasing after claims that the Messiah is over here or the Messiah is over there. When the Messiah comes, it will be obvious, and there will be some form of gathering of eagles to the carcass. Now, immediately after the tribulation of those days, so those days are going to bring the greatest tribulation that the world's ever seen. And immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then Mark talks about the same thing. In those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that are in heaven shall be shaken. And then we also come back into Luke now. Remember, where Luke left off was, he said that Jerusalem will be trampled until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so with that in mind, Luke then says, and there shall be signs in this. So in other words, as soon as when the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, and that abomination that Luke doesn't talk about, but the abomination happens, then there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. So in all this put together, we can see that the sun and the moon is going to be darkened. Stars will be falling. Now, stars in the Bible are any shining object in the heavens. It can be a shooting star, it can be a meteorite, it can be the stars, something happening to the whole universe, so that the stars are just falling right out of the universe, or becoming dark. The sea roaring, the powers of heaven shaking, or the powers of all the heavens are going to be disrupted. And next then we have Christ's returns. Matthew says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So here's where Jesus, again, shows that the second coming that he's talking about here is obvious everywhere. Everybody's going to see it. And that's why they're warned not to chase after false messiahs. Mark also says, and then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And Luke also says, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And so now we can summarize this part of the scriptures in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, talking about the desolation of Jerusalem. Remember, before this, he talked about that the apostles would go through their lives, the gospel would be preached, then the gospel would also be preached out to the whole world. So there would be a period of time when the gospel is preached out to the whole world. And then during that time, there would be signs and wonders that become more frequent and more powerful as the end approaches. Those are called the beginning of sorrows. And then he starts talking about the desolation of Jerusalem. And so we pick it up from there and we summarize everything that we've just learned. Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Of course, that happened in 66 AD and then again in 70 AD. Believers were told to flee, so they did that in 66 AD. The first time Jerusalem was surrounded. The second time was 70 AD. And then Israelites were killed and carried away captive to all nations because the Temple Mount was destroyed. The Temple Mount was leveled. Israelites were killed. They were carried away captive to all nations. There was great suffering at that time. And Jerusalem then has been trodden down by the Gentiles and will be trodden down until the time of the Gentiles ends. Now, at the end of the time of the Gentiles, there will be an abomination set up in the holy place, which is a specific area of the temple. So notice, the temple is going to need to be rebuilt so that the abomination can be set up there. All right, so at the end of the times of the Gentiles, there's going to be an abomination set up in the holy place. Believers are going to be told to flee to the mountains again. Believers are told, once again, flee to the mountains. So not only flee when it's surrounded by armies back in 66 AD, but also flee when you see the abomination set up in the holy place of the Jewish temple. People are told to flee to the mountains. A time of great tribulation will happen then like none other in earth history. So there will be no other time. This is going to be the worst time in earth history, and it's going to be the time called the Great Tribulation. We're going to get into more details on the Great Tribulation because the book of Revelation really gets into a lot of detail on the Great Tribulation. And we're also going to see some more prophecies in the Bible about the end of the world. False messiahs and false prophets will rise up during that Great Tribulation time, and then Christ returns at the end. So this brings us to the end of the video. This is section 1, part 2. Section 1, of course, is what the picture of the end of the world that's given to us by the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Our next video is going to be section 2, and we're going to start looking at the book of Daniel. We're going to look at the book of Daniel as a whole, and then we're going to look at the individual sections in the book of Daniel that predict the future. Thank you for watching and listening, and I hope you enjoyed it and got something good out of it. Thank you. Hi, this is Mr. Ray again. I have a correction. The next video is not the Daniel video. The next video is going to continue on with the gospel passages. Jesus isn't done yet. He goes on in these passages and others to describe gatherings of people. So we're going to find out what those gatherings are, who's being gathered, and when those gatherings happen. And then we'll also find out why Matthew, Mark, and Luke word things differently. I mentioned that a little bit in this video, where Mark talks about God being the creator. Matthew doesn't mention that. And then Matthew mentions a very specific spot in the temple called the holy place, and Mark doesn't mention that. And then a lot of what Luke writes is vastly different from either Matthew or Mark. We're going to find out why they word things differently without spoiling it for you, they word things differently when they're reporting what Jesus says because of the audience that they're primarily writing to. And we're going to find out who those audiences were and why the passages are worded the way they're worded because of those audiences that they're reporting to. And so the next video would be section 1, part 3, and we're going to talk about the gatherings described in the Gospels. And then the study of Daniel will come later in the series. That'll be section 2. All right, thanks again, and have a blessed day.